It's the Resistance Report, February 3rd, 2017. Good evening. Today, Donald Trump said that he was going to roll back something called the Dodd-Frank Act. Now, I want to talk about this for a minute because the purpose of these evening talks we have is to provide some context and to connect the dots and to see how things actually form a pattern. What's the pattern here? Well, Dodd-Frank, as you remember, was passed a few years ago in order to prevent a repeat of what happened in 2008. And that is, as you remember, big banks had been gambling in the stock market for years with your commercial deposits, and the big banks felt that they were in trouble. In fact, they were in trouble. Their debts were piling up. They couldn't, in fact, they'd gotten too deep on all sorts of very complicated derivatives. And they had been treating the American economy like a giant casino. They'd been placing bets. Those bets were very lucrative when they paid off, but when those bets turned sour in 2008, well, then we had a financial crisis and they had to be bailed out. They were too big to fail, said the Republicans and the Democrats, too big to fail. So you and I, our taxpayer money, our tax finance bailout went to all of the big banks. No major banker was indicted. Nobody was put in prison. Nobody was jailed. But at least we had the Dodd-Frank Act that was purportedly designed to prevent this from ever happening again. Unfortunately, millions of Americans lost their jobs. They lost their savings. They lost their homes. So it wasn't over exactly. In fact, Dodd-Frank was designed to prevent not only another financial crisis, but another crisis that would force millions of Americans to lose their homes and their jobs and their savings. Now, does Donald Trump think we all have amnesia? That we don't remember what happened 9 years ago? Well, I have news for him. The Tea Party movement and Occupy and a lot of the populist rage that's been growing over the last few years really stemmed from that bailout of Wall Street. Here's something else that Trump ought to know. In 2008, when everything began to collapse, the five largest banks on Wall Street had 25% of U.S. banking assets. They were too big to fail. 25% of U.S. banking assets in 2008. Today, the five largest banks have 44% of U.S. banking assets. In other words, they are much bigger. If they were too big to fail in 2008, they are gigantic today. They would never be permitted to fail today, which means that if they start going down the tubes, if they are allowed once again to treat the economy as a giant casino, they're going to have to be bailed out. Bigger bailout than before. You and I are going to have to pay. There are going to be many more jobs lost, many more savings lost, many more foreclosures. Does Trump have any idea? It's the people who voted for Donald Trump who are going to be hurt among the worst. Because it's their savings and their jobs and their homes that are going to go. So what does Donald Trump think? Does he think that we're stupid? Well, not only do we have amnesia, but we just don't know what's going on. As I recall, and it wasn't that long ago, we had a presidential campaign, and Donald Trump was talking about the swamp of Washington and Wall Street, and he was really going to stick it to Wall Street, he said, and he condemned, do you remember? He condemned Hillary Clinton for being too close to Wall Street, too close to Goldman Sachs. Well, we're in a new world, it seems, now that Donald Trump is president, because Goldman Sachs is now all over his administration. In fact, the head of his National Economic Council, Gary Cohn, is from Goldman Sachs. He was president of Goldman Sachs. We've got Steve Bannon, his chief strategist. I'll come back to Bannon. He is also originally from Goldman Sachs. We've got Steve Mnuchin, Trump's candidate, nominee for Treasury Secretary, also from Goldman Sachs. Jay Clayton, Trump's nominee for the Securities and Exchange Commission, to direct the Securities and Exchange Commission. Guess where Jay Clayton is from? Goldman Sachs. And how about Dana Powell, another top advisor in the White House? Guess where Powell is from? Goldman Sachs. Do you see a pattern here? This isn't just hypocrisy. I mean, hypocrisy is one thing. This is hypocrisy on top of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy that's near lunacy, that's going to hurt all of us, because when you get rid of Dodd-Frank, you are helping who? You're helping Goldman Sachs. You're helping the big banks on Wall Street who are going to be let loose again. Goldman Sachs was at the center of the financial crisis. Goldman Sachs defrauded investors. Goldman Sachs defrauded consumers. Goldman Sachs was in charge of a lot of the loans that ultimately cost people their homes. And who was there at Goldman Sachs? Many of the people who are now in the Trump administration. They did not get indicted. In fact, they are now sitting very pretty right there in the White House. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has all these loans, I think. I mean, who's going to lend him money? I mean, his business is ongoing. He's in charge of his business. He certainly is getting profits out of his business, even though he is not in charge of day-to-day management. He did not put his business into a blind trust. And what about those loans that he took out? What about those loans? Is there a payback here to the big banks on Wall Street? How many of those big banks are handling Donald Trump's loans? We don't know, do we? Should we know? Of course we should know. Why don't we know? Because he's not going to release his taxes. He hasn't released them. He said he would, and now he says, no, I'm not going to, because nobody cares. And he's not putting his assets into a blind trust. So he is taking away the Dodd-Frank Act, which protects us from another Wall Street breakdown. At the same time, we don't know how he's personally going to be affected by any of this. He enriches individual bankers. Maybe he's enriching himself and jeopardizing his voters, people who voted for him, and everybody else. Not a pretty picture. One other thing in terms of not a pretty picture, let me again draw a little bit of connect the dots here. And it's closer to home. As many of you know, the other night before last, a fellow named Milos Yiannopoulos came to the Berkeley campus, and Berkeley did open the campus to him. We believe in free speech here. And as you know, the police finally had to cancel a couple of hours before he was to speak because there were 150 masked agitators dressed in black here on the campus. Well, it turns out that the day before Yiannopoulos was going to speak at Berkeley, that's Tuesday, Breitbart News. Now, Yiannopoulos writes for Breitbart News. Steve Bannon, until he went working for Trump, Bannon ran Breitbart News. It turns out that Breitbart News, the day before Yiannopoulos came to this campus, ran a story about what Yiannopoulos would have said if he gave his speech at Berkeley. And he was going to give a talk about how federal funds should be withheld from universities that don't protect First Amendment rights. Because the morning after this event at Berkeley, these 150 agitators stopped him from speaking, caused the campus police to stop the speech. Donald Trump himself issued one of his tweets saying that, and it was completely mistaken, he said Berkeley was violating the free speech rights of Yiannopoulos. He said any university, Berkeley, violating the free speech rights and and subjecting people it disagrees with to violence and intimidation maybe shouldn't get federal funds. Well, isn't that an interesting set of consequences, or at least sequence? Because you had Breitbart News predicting that that's what the theme of Yiannopoulos' speech was going to be, and then Berkeley did open itself up to Yiannopoulos and respected his free speech rights, and then you had these 150 masked people in black garments who stopped the speech. Their violence caused the police to stop it, and then what happened? Then Trump says, threateningly, that maybe a place like Berkeley should not have federal funds, which is exactly what Yiannopoulos was going to talk about. And then Yiannopoulos goes on Fox News yesterday evening, and he says, doesn't talk about anything except, well, maybe if freedom of speech is not respected, these universities should not get federal funding. Oh, incidentally, last night on CNN, I raised the possibility, and I was pretty cautious about this. I raised the possibility that maybe, we don't know, but I wouldn't bet against the possibility that maybe Breitbart was in cahoots with some of these more violent demonstrators in order to lay the predicate, the basis, the justification for the Trump administration taking a larger role in overseeing universities and using the threat of a withdrawal of federal funds as Trump's stick. What happened then? Breitbart News almost immediately issued a scathing statement saying that I lied in saying that Breitbart News was organizing the riot. I didn't say that. I said I wouldn't bet against the possibility there was some possible connection. Do you see what I am getting at here? We know very little. We know that there's a connection between Yiannopoulos and Bannon and Trump and Breitbart, and we also know that Trump and Bannon are out to take more and more control of more and more democratic institutions. I don't want to add to the prevailing conspiracy theories, but I do want to put us all on at least notice that there's a possibility. We need to be vigilant about all of this. And what I really want to say, both about Dodd-Frank and the executive orders, and also about Yiannopoulos and free speech and everything else that has happened this second week, only the second week of the Trump administration, is that there is a lot of reason to be worried. I don't want to panic you. I don't want to freak you out. With these evening discussions, my goal is not to freak you out. Too many of you were already freaked out. No, I want to encourage your activism. There's reason to be encouraged and hopeful. We're making progress. We are actually forcing the hand of Democrats in Congress to take a much more, a stronger role in the resistance against Trump's nominees, against Trump's executive orders. Democrats are actually showing the beginnings of some backbone. That's great. That's your doing. That's what we need. We're having lawsuits. Lawsuits are starting all around the United States. State attorneys general are getting into the act. That's your doing. That's your pressure. You are doing it. There are boycotts. Nordstrom's just basically got rid of the Ivanka Trump line. Well, that didn't come out of nowhere. You're having an effect. We are having an effect. The resistance is building. In other words, I don't want to freak you out, but I do want you to understand how important your activism is. And I also want you to know we are containing some of this damage. We've got to work for impeachment or 25th Amendment. Basically, get him out on the basis of mental instability. But that will come. That will come. I'm going to take your questions now because I know you have some. I haven't seen the questions, So bear with me if I don't know exactly the answer. Sergey Sapato says, why do they call it the resistance? Why do they? Sergey, it's us. You too. Why not just vote in the midterms and restore sanity? Well, Sergey, we all have to vote in the midterms and restore sanity, absolutely. But in order to make sure that the midterms do restore sanity, we've got to be organized and mobilized. And that's why the resistance is necessary. Also, we've got to contain and make sure that Donald Trump and his appointees don't get rid of, eviscerate the democratic institutions, the basic democratic building blocks on which we depend for having a fair and free election. This from Lisa Brown. Why haven't the proceedings for his impeachment started yet? Lisa, the Republicans are in charge of the House and the Senate. They, in fact, the House begins impeachment proceedings. If they do begin them, the House is in charge of the starting those impeachment proceedings. And I don't think it's going to happen until Trump really oversteps the line in a big way and causes a lot of Republican voters and independents on whom these Republican members of the House are dependent to get really negative about Trump, and that is going to force them, the Republicans of the House, to think seriously about impeachment. They like Mike Pence, much more than they do Donald Trump. They're comfortable with Pence. They think Trump, many of them are beginning to think, if they haven't already, that Trump is unhinged. Helen Wood, when a sitting president of the United States is sued for a wrongdoing on his part in relation to executing his duties, who pays his legal bills? Asking for a friend. Well, Helen, I'm glad you're asking for a friend. If you're asking for yourself, that's fine too. Well, if a president of the United States is sued, his legal bills are being paid by the United States if he's sued for something that he did under the cloak and auspices of his presidency, of his authority. If he did something else that has no relationship to what he is authorized to do, those legal bills would be paid by the individual who is president. Now, this is from Carol Kent. Trump and Bannon's recent actions seem like shock events that are designed to divide people, cause chaos, and so on, could potentially be covering up things that are going on behind closed doors. What do I think? Carol, I think that some of this is shock and awe. Yes, it is designed to throw us off our stride, to immobilize, to divert attention. I think it is important to keep track of the big things. Number one, as I keep emphasizing, Trump's tax returns and his failure to put his assets into a blind trust. Number two, the Soviet, or I should say Russian, no, there's no longer a Soviet, the Russian connection, Putin and the Russian operations, people who might have been working with Trump people, and we don't know, and hopefully an investigation is going to reveal the extent of that. The constitutional impositions on freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the Muslim ban, all of that, basic issues that we need to keep our eyes on. And also Steve Bannon on the National Security Council Principals Committee. Demoting the intelligence people and also the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's a big deal as well. We need to keep our eyes on the big stuff, the structural and constitutional issues that Trump is perpetrating on us. The movement toward a tyranny. Michelle Heck. Is that how you pronounce your name? Heck? What consequences can a senator face for dereliction of duty? Not answering phones, not meeting with constituents, not responding to inquiries, and so on. I'm looking at you, Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey. Well, I understand Pat Toomey has been avoiding his constituents. Interesting. Pat Toomey? Well, if a senator avoids his constituents, there is a big penalty to pay, a big price, and that is you don't get reelected. There is no law that says a senator has to pick up his telephone or answer his constituents. But the incentive to do so is that you are elected to represent your constituents. You have a constitutional duty to represent your constituents. Now, the only way constituents can effectuate that constitutional duty is when it comes to election time. And therefore, Pat Toomey, you are officially in trouble. Susan Sullivan, can we sue the IRS for his tax records like we sued the White House for the Iran-Contra emails? Susan, the problem is we don't really have standing under the federal courts to sue for Donald Trump's tax records. Under certain conditions and certain times and situations, the only person who has standing to actually sue for tax records, who is not the owner of those records, who submitted those records, would be the President of the United States, unfortunately, and so that doesn't help us very much. No, I think this is public pressure. We're not going to get there through lawsuits. We've got to continue the pressure on Donald Trump. One piece of pressure, for example, is no Supreme Court nominees will be confirmed until we know more about Donald Trump, that he is a legitimate president. Joe Darlington, I'm attending a local town hall tomorrow morning that is hosted by my arch-conservative Congress member, Tom McClintock. What specifically can I ask or say to him that will most effectively put him on the spot or test his resistance, or best help the resistance? Well, Jeff, you have two options, really, two big options. Other people like you. You can either make a ruckus, demonstrate. You can let him know that you are not happy with him or the Trump administration. Or the other thing you can do is ask an embarrassing question. The kind of embarrassing questions I would ask: what do you think of getting rid of the Dodd-Frank Act? Isn't that going to hurt a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump? What do you think? Isn't the Muslim ban, doesn't it violate the separation of powers, the Establishment Clause of the Constitution? Those kinds of issues. Or don't you think Donald Trump should, like every president has before him, submit his income taxes? Or how about the Putin connection? Don't you think it's very important for the public to know and have confidence that Russian operatives didn't throw the election for Donald Trump? You can ask all those questions, and it'll be interesting to see how your congressman maneuvers, dances around those questions. Not only interesting for you, but interesting for everybody else at the town hall. Justin Poff, will you make a new documentary in the style of Inequality for All about this administration? Well, Justin, we are working on a new documentary right now. It was a little delayed because we didn't expect that Donald Trump was going to be the next president. And many of you out there have contributed to the documentary. My thanks to you. And we're going to be showing it on Netflix directly. It's not going to the theaters, it's going directly to Netflix. And we're hoping that it's going to be shown in April, May, or June, somewhere around there. And I'll get you more information about that. It's not so much about the administration, but it is about, in effect, what led to Donald Trump's administration and how inequality and political polarization and anger and Donald Trump are all tied together. It's also sort of personal, too. Okay, this is the last question of the night. Justin Shine. What are your thoughts on a national strike against Trump as a tactic? If you can't take off work, you could at least avoid purchasing anything. What do you think? Justin, I think a national strike is a good idea. We've got to be careful that nobody is penalized because they lost a day of work. I don't want a lot of people who are already struggling to make ends meet really be burdened by a general strike. But at the same time, it's important that the media and the public in general know how large the resistance is. And if the general strike can be organized in a way that doesn't hurt people, but does create a very clear signal about how large and powerful the resistance is becoming, I'm all in favor of it. And I want, on that note, because the weekend is coming up and I'm not going to see you until next Monday, to just say that I have not seen a kind of movement grow as spontaneously and as powerfully as this since the Vietnam War. And in the Vietnam War, we had, many of us, a very personal and kind of selfish stake, and that is that many families had young men who were going to go off and fight in Vietnam and felt that that was unjust. The war was unjust, and therefore those sacrifices would be without any purpose. Here we have people coming out because they care about the country. This is real patriotism. This is not fake patriotism. Just like we have fake news, there is fake patriotism that just prances around with a flag and says everybody else around the world who's not American is not as good as us, and we are great, and America comes first. That's fake patriotism. The kind of patriotism that is happening now in America, in this movement, this resistance movement, is happening because we love America. We love the Constitution. We honor our liberties under the Constitution. We understand that Donald Trump is, if not illegitimate, and I think he actually is illegitimate. I think he lost the election, not only popular vote, but I think there was Russian interference that delivered the election to him. But put that aside, even if he were quote-unquote legitimate, we feel that he is trampling on the basic constitutional liberties and rights that this nation values so much and holds so dear. And that's why this movement is so important. That's why this movement is to be a cause of celebration. You are involved. Many of you, I hear from you every day, many of you are coming up with new ideas for reaching out, for getting more people mobilized and organized. More boycotts, more ways of putting pressure on members of Congress, more ways of organizing yourselves to be heard. And we, therefore, are winning. You will win. And you have my thanks. See you next week.